So hello everyone. I think it's the fourth or the fifth seminar that I give in Heidelberg. And actually it's the first one that I give in Zoom. So I feel among friends. And what I'm going to present is sort of a work in progress. It's an attempt to create a new sub-discipline. So what I'm trying to do is to bring two disciplines together. I'm trying to bring the discipline of border studies / conflict studies, peace studies into the transition literature. So I've been working on these issues for a few years, and only lately I realized that I need to start to theorize, and this is what I will try to do through using a few case studies. Okay, so as expected, let me start by the motivation for research. As you know, there is a need for a transition, and there is a narrow window of opportunity. And we also know that in this process, there are leaders and there are laggards. There are those that are the first to adopt renewable technology, for example, renewable energy, and there are those who sit behind and wait for others to do so. There is massive literature on what makes you a laggard or what makes you a leader in adopting renewable technology. And you could see some of the variables that it mentioned, like the level of development, availability of the natural resource, whether it is sun or wind, environmental awareness, governmental incentives, and so on and so forth. The problem is that there is a puzzle here. So when you examine these variables and how or to what extent they can anticipate whether you're a laggard or a leader, you would see that they barely do so. Statistically wise, they're not really convincing in being able to predict if you're a leader or a laggard. And as you could imagine, of course, there are the usual suspects. Places like Denmark that have enough wind energy and can afford and high environmental awareness, or Hanover that, again, are the same reasons, or even ecological communities in Israel. And you could see that what they share in common is high environmental awareness and high economic abilities, and we are all aware of the environmental Kuznets curve. The issue is that there are leaders against all odds. If you look at places like on the Syrian border, or on Gaza Strip, or on West Bank, or the Bedouins on the Israeli Negev, you could see that they are definitely not rich. They are not likely to have a high environmental awareness, but it seems to me that they are leaders in adopting renewable technology. What is common to these four cases is that they are under a conflict setting, which actually made me think on the impact of a conflict on the diffusion of innovative technology like solar panels. So now let's see what does the literature of border studies or conflict studies has to tell us about what does it mean a conflict and how it may affect innovative technologies. In the slide, you could actually see the case from Ukraine and Russian missiles launched over a solar farm in Russia. So it gives you sort of a sneak preview on the effect of the conflict on renewables. So the overarching question is why and how conflict setting matters. So let's start with border studies. Essentially, it tells us that conflict means instability and uncertainty. It may impact the economy and willingness of the private sector to invest, especially if you're not sure if you will get your money back. It definitely impacts public opinion during the time of the conflict. When you discuss the conflict, it brings on board new concepts like sovereignty, territoriality. And we do know that quite often countries that are under a conflict, they have a desire to become energy or food or water independent. That would prevent other countries from imposing sanctions over them, like energy or food sanctions. And on top of it, when the army is involved, when there is a conflict, there is competition over land, because the army has a huge land footprint. So we could see that border studies or peace studies, they have a say on maybe future innovative technologies. But now let's move to the second stream. The second stream that I wish to combine into border studies is transition studies. Transition studies is a huge wave, and you could see some of the new journals that came about 10 years ago, which are highly successful in terms of impact factor, and even some old journals like Journal of Clean Air Production that all of a sudden tries to frame itself under the banner of transition studies. So there is a surge of journals that relates to transition studies. And of course, it's not a uniform literature. And you could see that there are a few streams within the transition studies, like the technological innovation system, the multi-level perspective, deep transition, and others. They are different, but they do share a common element, which is the way that they treat conflicts. Obviously, the literature does discuss conflicts, but in a different way. Mostly conflicts between the Green Coalition, which is the coalition of the new technologies, versus the Brown Coalition, the literature around fossil fuel and gas. So they mostly discuss conflicts in terms of new technology that comes to replace old technologies and the lock-ins and the path dependencies around it. Sometimes they do discuss military conflicts, and they describe them as exogenous shocks, shocks that are outside the system. And what they tend to do, from my perspective, they tend to bundle the meaning of a shock. They treat economic or health or a war in the same manner and in the way that it may affect the transition. They also bundle the meaning of a conflict. They do not differentiate between different types of conflicts, deep conflicts, shallow conflicts, pre-conflict, post-conflicts. For them, it's all the same. Quite often, they bundle the phases of innovation and how they may affect or how they may be affected by a conflict. So they do not make a difference between whether it is in the phase of just developing the technology, or when the technology takes off, or when the market is already saturated. And finally, when they discuss conflicts, they bundle the supply chain. They do not make a difference on how the supply chain may be affected by a conflict, whether it is upstream during the production, or whether it is during the transportation or the distribution, the downstream. And from my perspective, this gap has two profound implications. One is that there is a gap on the impact of the conflict and insecurity on the transition. The second gap is the reverse causality. We do not know the impact of the transition on the conflict and security. So what I try to do is fill up this gap in the work that I've been doing in the last few years. Okay, so now let me focus on only one element of the conceptualization that I try to do. And let's focus on the question of, is a conflict, a military conflict, good or bad for the diffusion of the technology? So I do not deal with the developing of the technology, only with the diffusion. And I think it's an interesting question because it can go ways. On one way, we can argue that a conflict may hinder the renewable revolution. Think, for example, on the uncertainty for the private sector who invests into the technology. They are not likely to invest if there is a risk that they're not going to get their return back. Think of the negative externalities of military activities. Quite often you are unable to build solar farms next to a military bases, and the other way around. If you build a wind farm, it may intervene with military activities. It jams the operation of the radar of aircraft. So in one way, it may hinder the diffusion, but on the other hand, if you switch into renewables, you become more resilient. You become more independent in the production of energy, which means that you may receive more state subsidies to become like that. So it can go both ways. And the question is, of course, under what conditions it hinders and under what conditions it encourages. So this is the big questions that I've been asking. And it seems to me that I'm more or less maybe the only one that really explicit on this question because it brings about two disciplines together, the conflict discipline and the transition literature. Now let me go into a case study, and then I will present one or two case studies, and then I will go back into the conceptualization. So as I mentioned, I try to develop a bottom-up theory, and for that I need case studies. And luckily, Israel has many advantages, but one of them has to do with the fact that I live in a conflict area. And it's an advantage in the sense that it's a perfect lab to test these questions. So let me focus on the case of Gaza. And Gaza is an interesting case study. There are about 2 million Palestinians that live over there. And Gaza receives its electricity mostly from Israel. It has its own power plant. And until recently, it used to receive electricity from Egypt. But the majority of electricity comes from Israel. The problem is that the system is very limited, and quite often it malfunctions. And on top of it, Israel has been using electricity as a stick against the Palestinians. When Israel wishes to change their behavior, they cut off electricity supply to Gaza. And that has been happening, unfortunately, too often. It's a policy of the Israelis. And you could see a high-profile Israeli politician that actually says that this is what Israelis do. If they behave, they get more. If they misbehave, they get less electricity. So the first challenge was to measure how much electricity a day people in Gaza receive. So this is the work I did with a master's student of mine and another colleague. And you could see the timeline. And we realized that as time goes by, on average, Gaza receives less electricity from Israel. It used to receive 24/7. Nowadays, about 8 hours a day of electricity on average. So obviously there is a shortage, but at the same time, you realize that many places in Gaza, they install rooftop panels. And the question that we have been asking is, what makes you a leader? If indeed you're a leader, and what makes a household a leader, and what is the profile of households who decides to stay behind? The easiest way to study that would go to Gaza, right? To do a survey, a door-to-door survey, and to ask a household, do you have a rooftop solar panel? If yes, how much did it cost you? When did you install it? What motivated you to do so? But as an Israeli, I'm unable to go to Gaza. And even people in Gaza are unable to do such a survey because it requires the approval of the Hamas. So we had to rely on remote sensing. We were lucky. We managed to get high profile or high resolution remote sensing images. And this is what we did. And we designed a study that, of course, has dependent variables and independent variables. The dependent variables are variables like how much renewable electricity is being produced in Gaza, how many renewable sites there are in Gaza. The independent variables are variables that relates to economics of scale, alternative energy costs. For example, if you have a diesel generator and it's less expensive, obviously you're not going to switch into renewables. Those that relates to opportunity costs, of course, if you have something better to do with your rooftop, you're not likely to install renewables, and geopolitical ones, which relates to military events along the border and within Gaza. So let me show you what came out from about 3 years of study by using remote sensing. This is Gaza Strip, and each yellow dot represents a renewable site. A renewable site could be at the size of 2 square meters or even at the size of 100 square meters. So it's a site. So you could see that in 2012 in Gaza, there were just a handful of sites, mostly around the center of Gaza. In 2014, there were about 30 of them, and we could see that few of them were already in refugee camps like Nusrat. But the majority of them are in Gaza, Khan Yunis, and Rafah on the Egyptian border, which are the urban centers. In 2015, you could see the situation. 2018, you could see the situation. And 2019, you could see that there are about at least 4,000 sites covering the entire Gaza Strip. And I'm sure that if we would do the survey today, the entire map would be yellow. So the next question that you should ask me, what does it mean in terms of electricity production? Actually, we measured it because we know the technology that they use, and we know how much electricity comes from other sources, like their own power plant or the Israeli or Egyptian electricity supply. And by 2020, 25% of the electricity in Gaza is renewable. Just to give you an alternative number, in Israel today, 80% of the electricity is renewables, comes from renewables. So Gaza seems to be 4 or 5 times more green in terms of renewables than Israel. And of course, you cannot compare the GDP in Israel to the GDP in Gaza. So it's a striking sort of an anomaly, which we were really puzzled by it. This number is a bit misleading because it's 25% out of an average of 8 hours a day of electricity. As I mentioned, it's a revolution. And the next question was, what stands behind it? What is the profile of a household that encourages him to be a front runner in renewables? So the first variable was around the Israeli attitude towards a solar panel exportation. Solar panels are being manufactured in China. They are being exported to Israel, and then the private sector brings them to Gaza Strip. And we were wondering, how does the military treat solar panels when they cross the border? Does the Israeli involvement is the restricting factor? So we approached the army through the Freedom of Information Act, and we realized that there are hundreds of thousands of solar panels that cross the border. Apparently, there are soldiers that count the number of solar panels. And we met with some of their officers, and it was clear that Israel does not treat solar panels as a security threat. So Israel is not a bottleneck in terms of Gaza importation of solar panels. Another variables which we could gauge through remote sensing is land use. So you could see 4 different land uses, whether it is a refugee camp, agricultural land, urban land, and suburban land. And the colors represents times that we ran the survey. We ran the survey in 2012, 15, 18, and 19, the remote sensing survey. And what we measured here is the average number of renewable sites per square kilometer. And you could clearly see that the revolution has started in urban centers and in suburban centers. And these are the 2 land uses that encourages the revolution. Okay, but apparently it's a collective action revolution because houses in Gaza are not shared by one individual. They are shared among tenants who share the rooftop. And if you wish to use the rooftop, obviously you need the consent of your neighbor. And we were really curious about the impact of the number of tenants on the tendency to adopt the technology. But as I mentioned, I cannot knock on doors and ask how many tenants there are. So I had to look for a proxy for the number of tenants. And the proxy is actually the height of the building. So assuming that 1 floor counts for about, or 3 meters high counts for 1 floor, then I could identify that most of the solar panels tends to be established on houses between 3 to 4 to 5 floors, which means that if there are not enough tenants, then the cost of the system is too expensive. But if there are too many too many tenants, then the electricity that can be provided is not enough. And of course, you need to reach a consensus between so many tenants. Let me skip it. Now let me move to another case study. And the second case study that I did with colleagues relates to the West Bank. The West Bank is a completely different institutional setting. It's a different ballgame. The West Bank is connected to the Israeli grid. People have electricity on the West Bank, and most of it is under the Israeli occupation. 60% of it is under the Israeli control. And in the West Bank, and between Israel and the West Bank, there is a dispute over land. Whenever it comes to Gaza, there is no dispute over land, and there is an internal Palestinian regime over Gaza. So it's a different setting. And on the West Bank, whenever you wish to build infrastructure, you need a permit of the Israeli military. But since it is connected to the grid, there are hardly any rooftop panels. Instead, there are solar fields. And we were curious about those solar fields, and we wanted to identify what triggers their establishment. So in terms of theory, most of the literature around renewables and geopolitics study the impact of renewables over security. They do not really study, they speculate, they assume, but it decided to take the opposite causality, to study the impact of precarious security conditions and how they may affect renewables. So what we did actually is build a data set of all applications submitted to the Israeli Security Service, to the Israeli military, about 40 applications to build large solar and wind farms. And for each application, we managed to get the protocols, the transcripts that actually say or actually document the decision-making process of the committee who was supposed to decide whether to approve or reject the project. And let me skip it. We did a similar exercise. We identified dependent and independent variables. The dependent ones are usually whether a project gets a permit or it is being rejected by the Israeli army. And the independent ones are issues that relates to clash or ongoing clashes between Israel and the Palestinians, those that relates to perception of territoriality, the nationality, of course, whether it matters if the application was submitted by an Israeli or a Palestinian. And let me show you what came from this statistical exercise. So here you could see the relative importance of several variables that we examined, and the dependent variable is the likelihood for a project to be approved by the Israeli authorities. And you can see that the most important variable is actually the size of the project. The larger the solar farm, the larger the wind farm, it is less likely to get a permit by the Israelis. But then we realize that there is an issue here because many applications were submitted and the developers who submitted them never got an answer. So we realized that what the Israelis do, they simply put the Palestinians on hold. So we decided to use a different dependent variable, which is the waiting time, and to see what influenced the tendency of the Israelis to put an application on hold. And you could see that the most important variable is what we call leg 2. Leg 2 means that there was a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And if you submitted your application a year or less than a year just after the conflict, then you are not likely to get a permit, which actually tells the developer, do not submit an application just after a conflict. Wait a year or 2 years, and then your chances not to be put on hold decreases. Then your chances to get an approval increases. So it's a very practical tool to guide developers on when to submit an application. So the third case study that I'm doing today relates to the Bedouins. The Bedouins are a nomad tribe. In Israel, there are about 300,000 Bedouins. In the world, there are about 30 million of them. And we decided together with 2 other colleagues to do what we call a space-time diffusion of renewable energy among the Bedouins. And I picked up this case study because it's a completely different setting in the sense that it's an inter-conflict, mostly over land. It's not an interstate or inter-conflict between political entities. It is within the jurisdiction of Israel. The conflict is clearly over land. There are land disputes between the Israelis and the Bedouins, and many of the Bedouins are not connected to the grid. And this is an intentional policy of the Israelis not to connect them because their houses are illegal. They never got a permit to build a house, and Israel has been using energy and water connections in order to try to stop the illegal building of the Bedouins in the Israeli Negev. More importantly, the process of the renewable diffusion is market-driven. There is no donor community who pays for it. It's an individual decision based on whether you can afford it or not. The case of the Bedouin is extremely interesting because when we discuss renewables, we often refer to the concept of off-grid. Communities that decide not to be connected to the grid or the grid does not reach them, and they adopt renewables. In the case of the Bedouin, we get a very unfortunate situation of what I call being under the grid. So there is a grid over you, and the grid connects the Israeli settlement, but it does not connect you because your houses are illegal. You never got a permit for it. Nevertheless, the Bedouins are creative, and they gradually adopt renewables. And again, we were asking the same question: what makes you a leader? What makes you a laggard? And in this case, we could actually run a survey. We could move from one community to the other, one household to the other, and ask him, what made you become a front runner, or why are you staying behind? And it's also an opportunity to try to isolate two variables and which are the perception of territoriality and sovereignty, and the variable of political uncertainty, whether you're going to be evicted because your house was illegally built. So again, we managed to get information through the Israeli system. And one variable that we wish to explore is demolition orders. When you build a house without a permit, the Israeli authorities, they issue a demolition order. And we were hoping to see how does that affect the tendency to adopt the technology. And we were lucky, and because now we could identify demolition orders along time and space. You could see them in 2015, 18, 2021, or another variable which we wish to isolate is land claims. The land is contested. The Bedouins claim for ownership over land. They go to the Israeli court, and we could do the same exercise, and we could see whether a case that the land is disputed affects your tendency to adopt the technology, which we do not know yet because it's work in progress. How much time I have left, Shai?
I think it's like 5 minutes or
okay.
so. Yeah.
Okay, super. I think the case of the Bedouin is extremely interesting because it allows me a different type of conceptualization. The transition literature quite often talks about a shift along time between having a diesel generator or using wood in order to heat your house. And then the grid comes over with progress and you're connected to the grid. And if you become richer and environmentally friendly, then you adopt PV, right? This is the normal trajectory that we find in the literature. But apparently in the case of the Bedouin, the transition would look completely different. They start the same, but as I mentioned, they are not connected to the grid because of the political circumstances. And because of that, they were early adopters in adopting PV. But nowadays, they undergo a process of regulation. And nowadays, many households that adopted PV all of a sudden became connected to the grid, which means that they can ask a question that has never been asked before, which is around the longevity of PV. What would they do once all of a sudden the grid becomes available? Will they neglect the PV? Will they have a dual system? Will they refuse to connect it to the grid? And again, for my literature review, it's a question that has never been asked before. And I will have to look for other cases that have gone a similar process. So in the last 2 minutes, let me do some conceptualization that may be applicable to the Bedouin case and other cases. So as I mentioned, I try to isolate the role of two variables. One is political uncertainty, meaning whether you're going to be evicted through a demolition order or whether you're not going to go through this process. And the second one is infringement over territoriality and sovereignty, whether it is high, meaning that even if you have the option to connect to the grid, you will not become connected because it's an Israeli grid, or whether it is low. And I can hypothesize, for example, I can argue when political uncertainty is low, meaning you're not going to get evicted, meaning if you do adopt PV, it's not going to be demolished, but at the same time, you're not willing to connect to the Israeli grid because you wish to become independent of the Israeli occupation. Under these circumstances, it is more likely, maybe, I mean, it's up to the empirics to show, to adopt PV. But the opposite situation can also happen. If your house is going to be demolished and you have no problem to connect to the Israeli grid, maybe you're more likely, maybe the lower the motive to maintain the PV after grid connection has become available. So I don't know, I haven't done the study yet, but we are gathering the information. It will take us about 2 years to start to do the statistics together with the survey. So now I'm in the phase, as I mentioned, of developing the theory based on a few case studies that I did in the last few years. But unfortunately, I did only the case of Gaza, the case of the West Bank, and now I'm doing the case of the Bedouins, which means that I need more case studies that vary one for the other in the extent of the conflict, the nature of the conflict. They may vary in the nature of the political regime. Maybe I should pick cases that represents full military control, like there is on the West Bank, or cases where there is no regime or hardly any regime, like on the West Bank, like on Gaza. And of course, I should pick up different technologies. Maybe it's PV, maybe it's wind, maybe it's thermosolar, different locations, different regulations, and obviously maybe the most important variable is the role of the private sector. And I assume that the private sector and the way it operates differ from one place to another, which is another variable that I need to be able to isolate.